So as was just announced, this meeting is being recorded. So our speaker today, Peter Ubertaccio, has graciously agreed to let us record the event today. I've had so many people ask me if it was going to be recorded because they really wanted to attend. And just for some reason, it's one of those days where folks had conflict. So thank you very much for that. So my name is Harriet Emerson, and I'm a hybrid program administrator here at the Eastham Council on Aging. And hybrid means that people can attend in person, such as you are this afternoon, and online. And we think that's a great feature because it really expands access to our programs. So many of you may agree with me that I can't believe it's September 9th. It seems like the month just started, and then we had Labor Day. I think that was the most recent holiday we have. But sometimes it's hard to keep up. And here we are on September 9th with a very consequential and very important, I guess you could say, they all are, presidential election approaching really fast. It's hard to believe it's just less than 2 months away. It seemed at one point in time it was months away, and now here it's kind of around the corner. So to help provide more information and perspective and context for this election, we're very honored and happy to have Peter Ubertaccio with us today. He is a vice president for academic affairs at Stonehill College, as well as associate professor of political science. He has deep expertise in presidential history. He's given many talks about it in various formats, in person prior to COVID, and also for major media platforms. Let's see. So, and his work has been featured in the Routledge Handbook of Political Management and Winning Elections with Political Marketing. So I think once again, very happy to have the opportunity to have Peter with us here today and provide some context. And so he'll provide some comments, provide the context, background, and then we'll have question after period after his discussion. So thank you very much once again, all of you, for joining us here today. Without further ado, Peter Ubertaccio.
Thank you. Thank you, Harriet. I really appreciate the invitation. I have to say that as I was driving out here, so we live in Marston's Mills. We've lived on the Cape for over 20 years. Whenever I work from home, which was not that frequently, the weather is not very nice. And the president of our college notices that. He's like, "I work from home today, it must be cloudy." So today is one of the very first days I got to actually stay on the Cape. And it's gorgeous out. And I really want to say how deeply impressed I am that you would choose such a beautiful day to come and hear a talk on American politics, because there are lots of other things I'm sure you could be doing with your time. I'm really grateful for the invitation to come. I wanted to just note that this talk on politics, one of the reasons why I'm so happy to engage with you is it's been hard to talk about politics over the past few years. And we have lost a little bit of our sense of civility as a result of some of what's happened nationally and around the country. So I think anytime we can find an opportunity to engage one another on not only the issues that we confront, but on the structure of our politics, or who's going to win, who's going to lose, those sorts of things, I think it's really healthy. I have been at Stonehill College for 23 years now. So I started as an assistant professor of political science. I became the director of the Joseph Martin Institute for Law and Society. If you recall that name, Joseph Martin is a former member of Congress from the Attleboro area who went on to become Speaker of the House of Representatives in the 1950s. I am now the vice president for academic affairs after having spent some time at Caldwell University in Caldwell, New Jersey. More importantly, I'm the father of 3 college students, all of whom are at school now. So my wife and I are trying to figure out this new stage in our lives where all of the students have left the house. I want to start by saying that I am a political scientist. I am not a mystery novelist. There is no cliffhanger at the end of my talk. There's also likely not to be a surprise ending. Political scientists really are not that exciting, and we don't have a crystal ball. And we spend a lot of time when we're thinking about American politics, if you're watching news programs or chat shows or listening to the radio, a lot of people who believe they have a crystal ball don't. And partly it's because dealing with the complexity of citizens in a democracy is just that, it's complex. People are complex. They make decisions that we might not always understand in real time, right? So it can be very hard to predict what's going to happen in any given election cycle. The best that I can offer you is just some analysis to think about why we are in the place where we are. And then I would really prefer to take your questions at the conclusion. I just find that I learn more by engaging with others, and would prefer that I spend a little time talking, but really more time engaging with all of you. So I look forward to any questions or thoughts that you have at the conclusion. So what I want to do to begin with is to tell you that despite it all, you can fill in the blanks of what all the all is regarding candidates and things that have happened. I have the sense that we are in a fairly conventional place in our country politically. Now, I leave it to you to determine whether you think that conventional place is a good thing or a bad thing, but it's still conventional. From the 1920s through the 1980s, presidential elections in the United States were often won in landslides. And those landslides produce a very clear policy and political dominance by one of the two main political parties. Close elections during this time period were few and far between. 1948, 1960, and 1968, and 1976. Those were, during this time frame, the anomalies. All other elections were very clear landslides for one of the parties. But consider over the last 30 years, since 1988, all of our elections have been relatively close. There have been no landslides, and there's not likely going to be one this year either. We are a 50-50 nation. This has been a long time in coming, and it doesn't mean that there haven't been clear victors. It just means that neither of the two political parties have established overwhelming dominance in the way that they had during that earlier 60-year period. Consider also that between 1954 and 1992, partly the same time frame when American presidential elections are being won by landslides, one party, the Democratic Party, established overwhelming dominance in the House of Representatives. Also no longer true. Since 1992, the House of Representatives has flipped back and forth between the parties 5 different times, sometimes with large margins, other times, such as now, with a razor-thin majority by one of the two parties. The Senate has been a little less stable in the House over the years, but is still flipped back and forth, and it is almost literally 50-50. Billions of dollars are going to be spent this presidential election. We could wake up the day after the election and the Senate could be 50-50. Could be. Not likely for reasons that I'll discuss just in passing, but right, it's not going to change dramatically. So when we look out to November from today, and I do want to caution us all, tomorrow is a very important presidential debate. It may be the only one. So please, as I'm speaking, remember there is a little asterisk. I can't control, nor do I know what actually is going to happen tomorrow night. And as we saw just a couple months ago, sometimes a presidential debate can change everything. Now, I don't think that will happen tomorrow for different reasons, but still a lot of news is going to happen tomorrow night that's going to help shape the contours of this race. So if we're looking out to November from today, the day before a presidential election at the end of the summer, it would seem that any of the following are likely. That Donald Trump will reclaim the presidency, and if he does, he will likely have a Republican Congress. That Kamala Harris will win the presidency with a Democratic House and a narrowly Democratic Senate, or that she wins the presidency and one or both houses of Congress remain or are Republican. It seems more likely that that would be the Senate. We could talk about that. So this is all really very conventional and quite frankly, boring. But this has been the norm in American politics for 30 years. We just haven't been able to go back to a time when there is an overwhelming consensus about who the next president should be that shows up in voting behavior, in voting results, each November. Now, having said all of that and established that I think things might actually be a bit boring this fall, which is not at all an analysis of the candidates themselves, right? It's really just what are the results going to look like. For that, I don't think there will be a big surprise. I do want to point out that if a baby was born in May, that child has witnessed some of the most unprecedented moments to have happened in a relatively short period of time in American politics. So despite the fact that I think the results will look conventional, this year has been anything but. It has really been extraordinary, which makes me wonder often, given the extraordinary nature of the election thus far and of one of the candidates in particular, why are those results likely to be so conventional? That's an open question we can discuss. But to remind ourselves of where we have been, on May 30th, a former president was convicted of 34 counts in a New York courtroom, becoming the first former president to also be a felon. And there are many other indictments against him in Washington and Florida and Georgia, where he is awaiting trial, some of which has been pushed back because of the Supreme Court ruling related to presidential power and authority. But still, there will be ongoing trials of the former president. On June 28th, not 1 month later, the incumbent president suffered through what is widely now viewed to be the worst debate performance ever by a presidential candidate, at least one of the two-party candidates. On July 13th, there was an attempted assassination of the former president, who was at that point the current leading candidate for the presidency. On July 21st, the incumbent president withdrew from the race. The latest that incumbent president ineligible to run for president has ever withdrawn voluntarily from a presidential election. On the very same day, the incumbent vice president announced her intention to run, and just 1 day later, on the 22nd of July, she received enough state delegate endorsements to win her party's nomination. Now, that wasn't the official nomination. That happened a week later, but still, that is just an extraordinary thing to have happened within 24 hours. She'll be only the second woman to be a nominee by one of our two main political parties and the first woman of color. Her entrance into the race has energized her party and base and has reaffirmed an extraordinary gender and age gap in American politics, which is not new, but is growing. So the vice president leads the former president among women by 13 points, 54% to 41%. He leads men by only 5, 51% to 46%. That's not healthy. First of all, that type of divide is not typically healthy. But if you're a Republican, former president, that's really dangerous territory, right? She's cutting into the group that you do well with, which it seems that she's doing. Still, the race is 50-50, right? So when we set the stage for this election, we often said, as was said during the introduction, something like, we often believe they're the most important election of our lifetime. And I'm sure one or both candidates are going to say something like that tomorrow night. They are, right? This is the most important election ever. Truth is, they all kind of are. History will judge them differently, right? But in the moment, any given presidential election is the most important one in our life. Each one can set the stage for the future direction of the country. They affect everything from Social Security to foreign policy. This election in particular brings somewhat familiar cast of characters, so much so that at least one of them, the former president, needs no introduction on his own. We've got the vice president on one side, no stranger to the country, but vice presidents often live in this very strange shadow. They are and can be at any moment the most important and powerful person in the country, and yet they live in the shadow of a president. They really don't have their own political identity separate from the president that they serve. The only person, this was a shock, I mentioned this to a family member who asked if Donald Trump wins, I don't know this for sure, but I'm not sure he really likes his running mate, but he doesn't really like many people, so that wouldn't be a shock on his own. Like someone said, well, if he becomes president, can he just fire JD Vance? And so a president can't fire a vice president. It's the only person that a president in the executive branch, the president cannot fire. They occupy a constitutional position, right? And they're elected with the president. And in many ways, they're as powerful as the president wants them to be, but they can't be fired by a president. So that puts Vice President Harris, in this position where she's been vice president for 8 years. She's run and not very, as we know, very successful presidential campaign before, but she's also having to reintroduce herself. Now, she's done so extraordinarily well. You could not have asked for a more flawless 5 to 6 weeks in American politics than what she has had. But it is a process of having to reintroduce herself because she's never been fully independent on her own because she serves the president. And then you've got Donald Trump, who I'm happy to take questions on that. And I feel at this point, I don't know what to add anymore to what we already know, but something to consider, which is surprising to many. He is only the second person in the history of the Republican Party to win that party's nomination 3 times. So he has complete control over the Republican Party in a way that no former presidential nominee has had. And the only person who did that before was Richard Nixon. Nixon did it in 3 non-consecutive elections. Trump has done it in 3 consecutive elections. He has an iron grip on his party, which I think for this election is certainly helpful in terms of getting the nomination, but could turn out to be a curse for him. The lack of competition, the lack of excitement on his side, he's always plateaued, right? He's always hit just the bare minimum. He's never won a majority, and it's a dangerous place to be. I just want to talk about some of the issues that I think will be prominent this time. I don't think any of this will be a shock to you. First is the economy. It always is. When the economy is good, when it's not good, the economy, jobs, cost of living, and this year, an issue in the election that we haven't had for a long time is inflation, right? And so it's been so long since inflation has been a primary driver for voters that we're not entirely sure how it will play out. What we know to be true is that it rarely plays out favorably for the incumbent party, right? They are often blamed for inflation and cost of living when they are in charge. So if you've been to the grocery store, if you've tried to buy a house, or if you know someone who has for the past few years, you know how this is impacting people. And voters are in a democracy. This isn't unique to the United States. We often operate with short-term memory, and we are thinking about how are we impacted now? So when Harry and I were speaking earlier, I said I was so delighted to come and speak in person because of the pandemic. And I had to remind myself, well, that was 4 years ago, right? I actually have been speaking to people in person, but the memory of that is starting to fade, right? Which is shocking given what collectively we went through during those terrible 2 years. People will respond to the short term. And when someone's having trouble paying groceries and they can't afford their rental, or they can't afford to come up with a down payment to buy a house, and if that's what they're thinking, right, they're going to take it out on the party in power. Now, the Republicans have probably harmed themselves in the sense that they had an opportunity to nominate a fresh face, such as it is. They've nominated someone who's got his own baggage for lots of reasons, but still often inflation and cost of living issues tend to not, if we're talking about those things, it's rarely because they're going well. And if voters are talking about that in November, they're likely to take it out on the Democrats. And polling consistently has inflation, jobs, cost of living as one of the top 2 issues for most voters. Secondly, and these tend to fall down because the economy is always so important in people's minds, but immigration and migration. So the issue at the southern border, the influx of migrants, states like Massachusetts using state resources, the humanitarian and budgetary impact of all of this. Typically, voters are ranking this second. It's no longer an issue on the border. If you've traveled internationally out of Boston Logan, you've seen up close and personal people living just in the terminal now being moved around the state, more migrants coming, though the flow has absolutely decreased since this past winter. It's still a humanitarian crisis and something that voters are concerned about. Again, that doesn't work well for Democrats because they're in charge. And despite the bill that wasn't passed because Republicans pulled it, again, voters will remember who was in charge during any particular crisis. Healthcare typically ranks third for voters. This is a perennial issue. The Republicans want to, again, do away with the now popular Affordable Care Act. When President Obama spoke to the Democratic convention, he noted, and I'm glad that he did, it was kind of funny, when it was unpopular, they called it Obamacare. Now they call it the Affordable Care Act because it's actually quite popular. And so this will, the cost of healthcare, voters perceive this as part of the overall inflationary environment, changes to their health plans, right? These are things that people are really concerned about. Abortion, reproductive rights are going to rank very highly this election. The end of Roe versus Wade has unleashed powerful, intensely powerful backlash across the country, favoring Democratic candidates. And states as varied as Kansas and Ohio to Vermont and Michigan and California, wherever over the past year and a half, people have voted on behalf of reproductive rights, have always won. There's never been a referendum where more restrictive rights have been approved. So, I think this is one of those harder to predict things, particularly among younger voters who are notoriously difficult to predict in terms of their turnout. They have never had a different world than, right? This is something completely new to them. And so them wrapping their heads around what this means for their future, there is no before for them where they remember what society might have been like before you could access reproductive health care. So it'd be interesting to see how this plays out. The evidence is whenever it's on the ballot, Democratic candidates or the Democratic position tends to do well. And it's on the ballot, again, many states across the country, including Florida, which I don't believe will be a swing state. But again, there's this undercurrent, and we're not really sure how it's going to play out. The fifth, I said I talked, what are the top 5 issues? It really depends often on where you stand politically. It could be climate change. It could be views on crime, education, guns, which typically don't move as many voters as we think. But the tide, with the recent school shooting in Georgia, I could have said that about anywhere because there has always been one within memory. And young voters find this they're particularly passionate about this issue. Project 2025 could be a motivating factor. It's unpredictable, just like a lot, in our politics. The truth is that when I said at the outset, people are complicated, they have a variety of opinions about a number of these things. We are rarely the broad strokes that we are portrayed, not we in this room, but we as citizens. We hold opinions that are contradictory, right? That might strike a partisan, a pure ideologue is unusual. But that's where most people live. And they live there quite comfortably, right? They like, for example, low taxes and access to reproductive health. And which party does that fit? Well, neither easily. Most voters live in that gray space. Let me talk just a couple minutes about the candidates, the campaign strategies, and then I'll turn it over to all of you. Again, as I said, don't have much to say about the former president, except he has a firm base of support that isn't going anywhere. He he can get to just about 50% just by being on the ballot. It's an extraordinary, he is an extraordinary figure for lots of reasons. Where his takeover of the Republican Party has not helped that party is that he aligns his own business interests with the party. So lots of the fundraising that's happening for the Republican Party is going to pay Trump Inc. in whatever format that is, including legal bills. So what is it not going toward? Well, they have 50 paid staffers in the state of Pennsylvania, and the Democrats have 375. So now others will fill in the gap, right? There are lots of big money operations out there and other kinds of political action committees. But one thing that is still true about American politics is you convincing people to turn out the vote is a human being to human being interaction. Always. So you're going to see lots of, depending on where you live, we don't see them much in Massachusetts because we're not a competitive state. But we get some of the New Hampshire stuff. So you may be seeing lots of New Hampshire ads, right? And television ads do not motivate people to vote. It's not that it's a waste of money. They don't motivate people to vote unless they are matched with some kind of human interaction. And that's where door knocking and volunteerism and phone banks and having paid staffers to organize all of this makes a difference. People getting new voters to the polls is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do, and millions of dollars on TV isn't going to move the needle at all. If a new voter doesn't know where to vote, then plastering TV with ads telling him or her how awful the other candidate is not going to help them. So phone banks and volunteerism are extraordinarily helpful. It's time consuming and it's costly, right? But it really does move the needle, right? Even in this social media environment. So if my kids said I have three children, they'll see it on social media. It makes no difference. If there isn't someone else saying, and this is where you vote, and this is when you vote, and I will drive you to vote if you need someone to do that, right? You need to have that connection. Democrats have that advantage, in part because Republicans simply are not investing in it. So note, I've said nothing thus far about whether the former president's own approach to politics helps or hinders him. I just accept that that is who he is, and his party isn't going to be able to be much assistance to him because so much of the money is not being funneled into a place that actually makes a difference. The vice president, the other major candidate, again, just a flawless month and a half. That will change. She has to be unlikable in order for the former president to win. And so you can expect tomorrow and then throughout the rest of the campaign, a concerted effort to make her unlikable and to attach her to all of the things that people don't like about the Biden administration, right? And they're going to go in on that. But I would say that if you couldn't have predicted this kind of summer in the spring, right? And from her choice of a running mate to the way the convention unfolded, to all of the interactions, to the excitement, to the enthusiasm, something has changed from where we were in the spring. If you had asked me in the spring, I would have told you I thought it was pretty clear that Joe Biden was going to lose the election. The enthusiasm was simply not there. One of his campaign staffers, they're based in Delaware, one of the staffers in the Delaware headquarters anonymously said in July that coming to work every day felt like a funeral. The week after he withdrew and she became the nominee, the staffer said every day felt like going to a wedding with an open bar. And so that's not enough to win, but you need, those are your people. You need that enthusiasm to really, get out the vote and turn the thing around. Okay. And here we are, however, 2 months to go, the race is tied. It's tied. That is telling, I think, about where we are as a country. I think it would have been tipped in Trump's favor if Biden was the nominee, but again, not a landslide. And if I think, if another Republican were the nominee, I think we'd be tied. I think we'd be about where we are. You already know which states to watch, because I believe that if you are in this room on a beautiful day in the summer, that you're not thinking about this stuff for the first time. Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina, right? Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona. Those are going to be the key states to watch. What I tell people is, if it looks like she's going to win Florida, she's probably going to win. Because Florida is no longer a swing state, right? It had been for many years, but it is not. It is a Republican state. If it looks like she's going to win Ohio, she's probably going to win. Ohio's not a swing state. It is a Republican state, right? We have gone through a change. It used to be, Ohio was Pennsylvania. If you could win Ohio, you could win the presidency. Now they're focused on Pennsylvania. If he wins Pennsylvania, he's likely to win. If she wins Pennsylvania, she's likely to win. It's not enough, but it is that kind of swing state where they're about 50-50. This will have repercussions for the Senate races and the House races, right? It is entirely possible that the momentum is maintained and Vice President Harris wins by 5 to 7 percentage points, a really healthy victory, and still loses the Senate. Because at the end of the day, the lineup of states that are up this year are not in states Democrats do well in, right? Montana, West Virginia. Montana is just a red state. And sometimes that's all it is. There isn't a deeper meaning. She could win the presidency by healthy margin and lose the Senate at the same time. That goes more to structure of our system than what people prefer. But Democrats are definitely going to lose the West Virginia Senate seat. So now they're at 50-50 automatically. They have to win everything else and the presidency in order to have 51 votes. And it just does not seem likely that they're going to win Montana or Ohio, right? Now, if they do, and she wins the presidency, right, and we convene December when I hope it's over, we'd have really something fascinating to talk about, because that would upend what we think we know about American politics. So let me just close by saying the strategies that you will see on display tomorrow night aren't going to be that difficult for us to understand. He needs to bring her down. He needs voters thinking this election is about inflation, crime, such as he perceives it, and immigration. That's if people turn off their sets tomorrow night and you're an undecided voter in Georgia or Pennsylvania and you're thinking those things, right, that's a win for the Republican candidate. If that same voter turns off and they're thinking a return to Trump is a return to chaos, if they're thinking further restrictions on reproductive rights, right, then that's a win for her and Democrats. But if it's not backed up by that get out to vote effort, right, it's ultimately meaningless. If that voter is thinking that in Georgia tomorrow night and no one follows up with them, no one calls, no one knocks on their door, right, that's a lost opportunity. And so most of the momentum and energy that Democrats have been able to create since July has wisely, I think, been funneled into building out those organizations on the ground to get more people out to vote. You're going to see a lot of ugly ads. Can't save you from that. Also not new. Part of the challenge in American politics and civics is having to weed through all of that, but they will be incessant. And again, if you get any of the New Hampshire stations, and most of the stations that we see down here also go into Southern New Hampshire, voter rich in a state that is electing a governor, right, has 2 members of the House, and is a swing state in some instances. I actually think it's moved too far away from Republicans this time to be winnable. But because of the closeness of our elections, even a state with just 4 electoral votes becomes hugely important to one or both of the parties. I was talking to Harriet earlier. I've been really chagrined by the state of our politics over the past 8 to 10 years. There's not a lot that I find uplifting. But, and I'm not a historian, and I don't pretend to be one, right? Historians live in the past, political scientists don't, but any good political scientist should depend a lot on historians for the work that they do. And so I do remain fairly optimistic because I think the country has been through extraordinary challenges before and has come out on top. And though the past 8 to 10 years have represented a series of challenges, I'm not yet convinced we're at the depths of where we have been in the past during other particular moments. So I caution all of us. I say the same things to my students who are encountering all of this for the first time. And it's important for us to remember that for young people, what many of us view as abnormal is normal. I'm not sure that's healthy, but it does mean that we have to figure out how we talk about these things to them, right? These are the formative years in their lives. So the young man who was helping us out earlier, who's a senior in high school, this is normal for him, right? It can be hard to convince people who are experiencing normal that it's actually not. And sometimes we end up talking past each other as a result. However, there's still some things that remain to be true, right? Voting is important. Even in a state like Massachusetts, which is not a swing state, the only prediction I will offer to you is Kamala Harris is going to win Massachusetts, probably by 20 points, right? But there are lower races. You have competitive state rep races out here, competitive state senate, right? The process, the action is still really critically important. I hope that while I don't expect it to be a landslide, I wouldn't mind a landslide every now and then just to settle some issues. I would love to be able to visit with you in mid-November and talk about what happened. I fear if I were to visit you in mid-November, we might still be waiting because the country is so evenly split that the results may not be fully in. All right, I'd like to now stop talking and just take any of the thoughts or questions that you have.
And Peter, may I ask that you repeat the question for our folks at home?
Yes,
yes,
absolutely, great.
Thank
Yep.
you, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I have 3 things, but one of my questions is you listed a number of things that you feel are the issues that will urge people to vote one way or the other. Would you speak to the role of democracy? Because that's been, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
Fascism versus democracy is one of the way things are framed. And it seems to me that it's a compelling voting urgency.
So yeah, it's an excellent question. It's really on when we think about the issues that move people one way or another, what about the issue of democracy, saving democracy, upholding democracy? So I think my answer isn't going to be very satisfying to you. So note that sometimes as a political scientist or analyst, I often have to check the things that I believe in versus what data tells me. So I believe that it is important to vote and to uphold democratic standards and norms. And I'll attach the rule of law, which is not the same as democracy, but I think that, we can vote based on that and should. But public opinion polls don't indicate that most people agree with that. Now, if you tell them in the abstract, do you believe in democracy? Do you think democracy is important? Do you think the rule of law is important and that we should uphold it? Most people say yes to that. But if you ask them, what is it that is motivating them to vote? What are they thinking about when they vote? They're not often thinking that. And that is fascinating, right? Perhaps upsetting, but I think it just doesn't rank very highly. If you were to give people a list of things and you put it on there, they might check it off. But if you just asked people, what are you motivated by? What is of interest to you? What do you care about? What are you concerned about? The economy, and then they might even say, well, the economy, inflation, jobs, cost of living, people might view those as distinctive issues, right? And then it could be, it ends up ranking very low. And I caution us all, like that it's easy also to kind of be unnerved by that. But people do not believe that there is a distinct threat toward democracy. Yeah. That doesn't mean they're not upset by things like the attack on the Capitol. So I just think it's important to compartmentalize, because they are. And when confronted with that, people are unnerved by it and they're frustrated by it. But I just think, if I were to pull you all together as a focus group and asked you, you may not be a representative body again, because you're here, just asked you to list those things, you're probably not going to list democracy as top 5.
My follow-up question.
Yeah.
It has to do with AI, artificial intelligence, and in one of the previous elections, Putin was charged with a lot of things in the manipulation of information by Russia in our elections. And now the complexities of AI already have been, according to the BBC, and just, have revealed lies and misinformation, and people are so gullible. So I'm wondering, is there, what does that leave our process for truth telling or fact checking or anything?
Yes. So the question is on AI and the manipulation of media in order to influence an election. It's uncharted territory. Now, let's be clear. Since democracy was invented, there have been attempts to manipulate it by misinformation, right? So the phrase yellow journalism during the late 19th and early 20th century, you may recall from your history that newspapers used to be sponsored by political parties. So, and we know there are no longer newspapers anymore, but back in the day, many newspapers took their name from the party that sponsored them. So the Springfield Republican is one that's still published today. The Springfield Republican got its name from the Republican Party, which had sponsored it, right? The Republican Party at that point in history was a northern political party in a way where it's not today, right? So now they were not interested in truth telling. The only journalism became independent when our economy was producing such so that there'd be independent advertisers willing to fund it. So there have been attempts throughout history to misinform the public into believing things which were not true for political gain. Now, what we're seeing is a highly specialized technological advances to do that very old thing, right? Find ways to misinform people. And with the demise of traditional journalism, it's easier to do. So my students, for example, when I quiz them, I'm teaching an introductory class this semester, which I haven't taught in a while, and I ask, where do you get your information? It's not shocking. They get it from social media, from apps, from YouTube. And of course, my brain explodes. I'm like, that's not news. That's not journalism, but I keep it all in. We haven't caught up with the advances in a way that we might have in the past. And so it's a real challenge to the stability of democracy when it is so easy to manipulate an election based on social media, money. These are well-funded operations that know exactly how to depress turnout. It's not really about getting people to vote. It's about keeping people from voting or being so angry and frustrated that they'll vote in a particular way if they do vote. Jimmy Carter once said many years ago, the United States elections are notoriously decentralized. We have 50 independent state elections with their own rules, with their own ballots, with their own methods. We notoriously underfund the machinery of our democracy to protect us. So Carter once said many years ago, back in the day, he used to travel around the world monitoring elections. And before he would go, he would say a country had to meet certain baseline criteria before the Carter Center would get involved. The United States wasn't even close to meeting that baseline criteria because we're so decentralized, we so underfund the protection of democracy, which I know is not quite your question, but it's something that I'm really fearful about. The use of AI, the amount of money and the technological savvy behind it, confronting a democratic reality, small d democratic reality, which is we have underfunded elections that are really staffed by volunteers. And that's quaint. And it's kind of a Rockwell-esque view of democracy, but we haven't changed much over the course of the past 100 years. So I think it's a real problem, which there's not an easy answer. Yes, sir.
Talk a little bit about the electoral college versus popular vote.
Yeah. So I raise this issue with my students all of the time. And I usually ask them, they think there's an answer to this. It's really a trick question. It's a little unfair, my part. How many countries choose to elect their chief executive by a mechanism such as the electoral college? And so their brains start, if they've got their tablet in front of them, looking it up. And the answer is nobody. So why do we? And so we have this conversation about the Constitution, about the unique circumstances of the founding of the country and how the Electoral College was a political compromise to allow the small states, the big states to feel like they all had a stake. That it has persisted has more to do with, I think, the complexity of changing the Constitution in a 50-50 country than anyone's affinity for that particular method. You can come up with a whole series of explanations for why it's useful, but the truth of the matter is before the 2000 election, it was the country a size of a continent trying to run democracy. The Electoral College was viewed as a way of trying to ensure that you had elevated statespeople running for president. That worked twice during the first two elections of the country. And then most everyone else has been viewed as just your kind of typical politician. And a way for small and big states to ensure that they could maintain political union. Again, if we would have been running so much would change if we had a direct popular vote. There'd be more candidates, there'd be more parties. So one of the things the Electoral College does is because you have to get to 270 electoral votes, and you can only do that by winning state by state. It privileges the two main political parties. They have the resources to be able to do that, whereas smaller parties never win a state, let alone enough states to get to 270. If you just had a popular vote, it depends on how you can construct it. You could have runoff elections. If no one gets 50%, right? You could just have whoever gets the most votes wins. It would change the whole conversation. And I think nobody feels, Republicans are privileged in the Electoral College because of the control over small states, enough small states. The Electoral College and the Senate are more Republican than they would otherwise be if you didn't have it. But there's, we haven't had a Congress pass an actual budget in over 10 years. The idea that they would amend the Constitution to change it is unthinkable to me. And what happens is when there's an issue, in the 2000 election, and then again in 2016, where the person who lost the popular vote won the presidency, strikes many people as anti-democratic. But there just isn't enough continual momentum to want to do anything about it. And ultimately people end up feeling like the 2000 election may be a better example. That was about as 50-50 as you were going to get. Someone had to win. Right? I think people just tend to throw up their hands at it. I'm not sure it's healthy to not continue engaging with that particular mechanism for electing a president. There are other methods. You could have just the popular vote. You could have a popular vote where, such as we have now, some semblance of it. There are primaries in the general election. You could have a general election and nobody gets 50%, and you have a runoff election between the top two candidates or States do this. Louisiana does that, for example. You have to have 50% or more. So Trump will do better than expected. Well, I shouldn't say that. Trump base of support guarantees him north of 200 electoral votes just by being there. Even if he loses by 7 to 10 million popular votes, there's a good chance he could still win the Electoral College. I think it's unhealthy to have that kind of discrepancy between a popular vote and the ultimate winner. But I also don't think there's enough momentum to change it.
Doesn't checks and balances get around that? Your popular vote counts against the Senate and
Yeah.
House.
Yes, so this is all right. I don't think that the framers never understood the democracy, couldn't have understood the democracy we have. But they understood that you often do want what they would have called counter-majoritarian impulses. I'm not sure I'm equally comfortable with saying, well, whoever wins a popularity contest should rule supremely. And so, yeah, you've got these other checks and balances in the system, an independently elected Senate and House, an independent judiciary, states, right? And so in their view, the things that many of us view as, say, inefficient and messy, in their view, like, well, yeah, that's partly the point. You want inefficiencies if you're talking about power. So much has changed. Again, I don't think they could have imagined the world that we lived in, but there is something to that, that I think they had a very good insight into human nature. And so they very deliberately created an institution that was designed to be inefficient. And it tests our ability to want to continue to live with that inefficiency. But their creation was, in some ways, works very well. It frustrates the heck out of us. And Madison in particular would have said, well, that's the point. You can have a really efficient system that allows any popular movement to gain power and do whatever it wants. Or you can have an inefficient system that tries to check that along the way. I'm painting with some very broad strokes, but yeah. Yes, ma'am. Oh, right here. Yeah.
I had the same question.
Oh,
about the Electoral
the Electoral College, yeah. Yeah, it's a fascinating system that no other advanced democracy chooses. Now, you know, it's okay to be anomalistic, but that is interesting to me, right? No one else chooses that kind of method. Now, again, you know, if you can channel the framers of the Constitution, what they might have said is, well, there also are not many continental-sized democracies, and that we have made it work. They thought that these institutional structures they were creating would protect democracy from its worst impulses. Right. So when I have this conversation with my students all the time, we talk about, what are you willing to say you should vote on? Should everything be subject to a vote? And they immediately start to think, well, no, not everything should be subject to a vote. There are some things, and of course, Lincoln thought that too, and so did the framers of the Constitution. Or Martin Luther King. He said, well, you can't vote to do a moral wrong. So there are all these layers of complexity, and they thought the Electoral College, among others, was a way to protect democracy from its worst impulses. Now, they would, I think it's fair to say, and I don't mean to castigate, but I think they would have, they had a particular view of demagoguery. They also thought that these institutional devices would protect us from demagoguery. I don't think that it has. So I try to remind my students that we should always be critical, apply a critical lens to what they've done. I don't think the framers of the Constitution also thought of themselves as so perfect that there would have to be no, right? The Constitution itself creates the ability to change it. And many of them changed their minds on a whole variety of things. I think they did master work that always needs some fine tuning, and the way in which it's evolved hasn't really protected us from the demagogues that they were so worried about.
I have a question.
Yes.
About, wondering if you have any idea or thoughts on the actual percentage of people who or will vote or register to vote who are actually truly undecided?
Yeah.
And perhaps, you know, is it more of a, whoever's going to win in November, or more of a matter of persuading those undecided voters or getting your voters to the polls?
So the question is on undecided voters and how do we get, is it more about just getting your own people to the polls or also persuading undecided voters? So I think the answer is both, because there are enough undecided voters in really close states to make a difference. So even if the percentage is small, if only 3% of Pennsylvania voters are undecided, that can swing Pennsylvania one way or another. So it's both. So what they're going to be doing is in states where you can still register to vote, lots of voter registration drives, particularly among Democrats, because those tend to appeal to young people who are overwhelmingly Democratic. So you're going to see a lot of that. And then you're going to see a lot of phone banking, a lot of get out the vote efforts designed to get people who are already inclined to get to the polls. And then a lot of messaging to try and get that, you know, she will, if she can persuade, I'm thinking of the suburbs around Philadelphia. My daughter's in college in Philadelphia, so I end up spending more time there. I love Philadelphia, I love the region. I love being in a swing state because I'm not used to that in Massachusetts. The suburbs that literally ring the city of Philadelphia used to be Republican. So President Bush the first won them by 60% of the vote in 1988. Joe Biden won them by just north of 60% of the vote. So that's a realignment. Same geographic area, was Republican, is now Democratic. So she needs to win that, but she may need to win that by an even greater margin and get more of those people to turn out, right? So it's going to be focused on both of those things. Now, we've never had a national presidential election in modern American politics decided solely on the issue of reproductive rights and abortion. This election won't be decided solely on that, but it is going to be a huge unknown. A lot of those areas, if they're still Republican, are moderate Republican. What I like to call old style Republicans. You know, it's shocking to my students to learn that the Republican Party in 1976 nominated a pro-choice candidate. President Ford was pro-choice. President Carter was pro-life. That world is gone, right? That just doesn't exist anymore. And there are many Republicans who, people who are conservative, who have grown up with Roe versus Wade and think it should be protected. And if she can motivate those people to vote against their other interests, then she's probably going to win a state like Pennsylvania. So I think it's going to be a combination of both of those things. And it will be fascinating to watch. One thing that I'm always looking for is she's going to lose Montana. But how close is it? Can she, because if she can do better than Biden in Montana, could that be enough to save a Democratic Senate seat? Montanans are fiercely conservative. They're fiercely anti-government. So Roe versus Wade plays differently in Montana than it does in the evangelical side. A lot of Montanans don't like government at all, whether they're telling you how much you should be taxed or whether you should have the ability to choose to have an abortion. They don't like that either, right? It's a really complex issue. So she's going to lose it. So we're not going to look, when you're going to see that red pop up pretty early on election night, but by how much will be really fascinating. If she can cut into his lead in a state like Montana, she might just save a Senate seat, and it might be indicative that she's doing well in areas that typically not hospitable to Democrats, like the rural vote. You're going to see a lot of red on election night. Those are all very small rural counties, right? So is she losing it by the same margin that Biden lost her, or is she improving upon that? Will tell us a lot about the future direction of the party and what's going to happen at the end of the night. Sorry.
What are your thoughts about the Cheneys and other prominent Republicans coming out for Harris?
Yeah.
Does that have any impact on?
It's a really good question. So the question is on, the Cheneys, the former congressman, former vice president, and other prominent Republicans coming out for Harris. We have not had a, other party for, that's been meaningful in a long time, meaning Republicans for Harris. There used to be Democrats for Nixon and Democrats for Reagan. And then there was briefly, it's hard to believe that this is true. There were Republicans for Clinton, the first Clinton, 1992. And those were pretty meaningful moments, right? We haven't had that in 30 years where you've had any kind of meaningful attempt by notable members of one party to convince people to vote for the other party. So I am utterly fascinated that Kamala Harris's coalition will include Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Dick Cheney. Right, that is, I think it is telling. Now, how deeply does it resonate? Again, it doesn't need to resonate that deeply. If you are a Republican in that suburban location in Philadelphia, that's all it might take to say, if he's out there saying, no one questioned his bona fides as a Republican, as one of the most conservative persons ever elected to national office. So he's not becoming liberal, and he doesn't agree with her on 9 out of 10 issues. But if he's saying you should do this, it's a signal. And lots of Republicans, former members of the Trump White House, right, are doing the same thing. So I think, again, it probably will move enough at the margins to make a difference. Whether it hands her the presidency, because as we go through this exercise, I'm always having to remind folks, I tend to view myself as a fairly centrist person by temperament and politically. One of the nice things about that is I have Republican and Democratic friends and family members, right? Mostly, as it's a stereotypical, mostly my uncles are Republicans and friends in the academy are Democrats, right? So I find myself living in between this two space. One thing that some of my partisan Democratic friends don't like to be reminded of is that I'm paying more at the grocery store every week. And I'm trying to send my 3 kids to college. And it's painful. And so the question is, are people willing to vote, even if they are Republican or conservative, against the things that are causing them pain and frustration because they're so worried about a return of the Trump presidency? And that's what Dick Cheney is signaling. What he's trying to get people to come to a conclusion on is that despite everything else, he's still worse. And that's hard for people to do, right? So I don't know, but I'm really fascinated by it.
Do you have any comment on, it seems to me at least, the fact that Kamala Harris as a candidate is not being spoken about so much as being a woman compared to the discussions that we faced when Hillary Clinton was running for president?
Yeah, I think, again, probably because it's not new, right? So she's not the first woman, she's not the first person of color. So the country has progressed a bit, but she will be judged differently tomorrow night. There's still a gendered lens that people apply, right? So we know what to expect from the former president. But you can be sure that if she adopted his tone, she'd be judged differently. There was a fascinating article, and I can't believe what people will say, but we just live in this moment. There's a fascinating article, I think it was either in the Washington Post or the New York Times, yesterday or the day before. One of her former staffers, anonymously, of course, was criticizing her, saying how difficult it is to brief her because she has read everything you've sent her and then marks it up with her notes. And the person was literally talking to the press about how challenging that is, right? Now, of course, she's a former prosecutor, senator, vice president of the United States. at a minimum, you tend to think you want those people reading the briefing materials and making notes in the margins and pushing back, right? But this was viewed as a critique, and it is very gendered, right? Strong woman. Because if you just read it and didn't know who they were referring to, well, how is this even an issue? Well, it's an issue when it's a woman. So I think she's right. They're right not to focus on it. If you watched her address at the Democratic National Convention, no, she's not. I think that's a wise politics. She's not talking about the history-making nature of her nomination and is focused on you. One thing, I'm old enough now to be upset that Bill Clinton has gotten so much, because I remember when he was so much younger, right? So I was watching that and I kind of just amazed at the transformation and trying to remember what it was like in 1992 when he was, he goes on at length if you watch the Democratic Convention. But he said something that I was fascinated by. Democrats, he's always been able to do better than many other politicians. And he said, when Donald Trump speaks, count the ayes. Anyone hear this? It was fascinating because it was so simple. Clinton has always had the ability to kind of figure out how to talk to people simply. And so he just said, count the ayes. So millions of people across this country have been spending the past few weeks, if they're listening to him at all, and it's remarkable. It's remarkable how many times Donald Trump uses that I as usually in a victim setting. And so one thing that Harris has done masterfully is to try to make her messaging about you. And this is where I think the Republicans for Harris organization can be of service, right? That's a really hard thing to do, to make it about you, to focus on you when everyone wants to focus on that. And then by implication, she doesn't even need to say it. The contrast will be he's focused on himself. So, if she can make that stick, then it's a very winning message that will be held by all of these Republicans who are out there saying, vote for her. And the final thing I would say, again, I'm not sure how much of our young people, Dick Cheney has his own baggage. All national politicians do. And history will, I think, in certain matters, particularly the Iraq War, probably not be very kind. It's a very courageous thing to do. Like, I think Democrats are handling this better than I would have expected, right? Because they're actually, many of them are just embracing it. And her response to it was just kind of masterclass. Because Cheney is, for many Democrats, like they wouldn't be caught in the same room with this guy. I think that they are handling it very well. So I'd love to come back to all and talk to you and say, I'm sorry that I got it so wrong because there's a landslide in November. I don't think that's going to happen, but these are the kinds of things that you would be watching along the way to try to figure out where is it all headed.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I don't know when we were first corresponding about having you have to come and speak, if we even knew the date of the the second, that there was going to be one tomorrow. I don't recall that date.
Yeah, I don't
But
think
anyway,
that this just turned out to be a good.
yes,
Yeah.
serendipitous, that the timings that we had the insight. And I feel like we've just begun to scratch the surface, Peter, really seriously,
Yeah.
sincerely, of your knowledge and your insight. So what I would like to do, if you would consider it, perhaps having you back here and early
Would love to,
and,
yeah.
and post certification of electoral. Do I have that terminology right?
Yes, so that will happen in, as we know, right, in January.
Right. So perhaps after that, so I can, work with your calendar, because I think I just learned so much today and it was really interesting. I think then having some getting passed and hopefully everything settled in early to mid-January. So
That would be delightful.
So thank you so much again. This was great. I really.
Thank you very much.
Very helpful. So once again, thank you for coming here today. And I just want to point out, we have several other events this week. On Wednesday, we'll have Andrew Gottlieb from the Association to Preserve Cape Cod. And on Thursday, we'll have Tom McNellis from the East Ham Climate Action Committee. And then on Friday, we'll have Jamie Adaki. She'll be talking about women, midlife and hormones. It's for everybody, women and the men who love them. So I hope they'll join us for those events, and those will all be online and on Zoom, so which makes it easier to participate. So thank you for coming and joining us on a beautiful Friday afternoon. I'm sure everybody's ready to get out in the room and start enjoying it. But thank you.
Yeah,
So
sure.
once
No
again, that
problem.
was really interesting, very informative, and we'll all be watching tomorrow night, I'm sure. So,
All right, thank you.
all right, thank
Thanks so
you.
much.
Thank you so much.